Hey guys, it's Emily. So I don't know about you, but I've been noticing a lot of activity at my bird feeder at my house and also the feeders here at the Grass River Center recently. So today I wanted to talk about what songbirds eat in the winter. And believe it or not, even those really frequent visitors to feeders, things like chickadees, nuthatches, titmice, they actually do get the majority of their winter food from natural sources. And so we'll talk about exactly what they're eating in the winter when it looks to most of us like a very scarce landscape in terms of bird food. But before we talk about exactly what they eat, I want to talk about just some general strategies that songbirds use in the winter to find food. So first thing is flocking. Birds in the breeding season, like the spring and summer, obviously very territorial and usually do not tolerate other birds, at least of the same species, in their territory. But in winter, that requirement for your own territory is kind of lifted and relaxed. And so flocking actually helps birds find food because they can get information from other birds, and there's just more eyes out on the landscape looking for food. And also, it's more eyes being vigilant for predators. A second kind of related strategy to that for finding food in the winter is communal roosting. Birds like crows especially do this, usually in urban areas. I don't know if you've ever seen a congregation of hundreds of crows just descend on, a couple trees at night in the fall and winter. But that's sort of a similar thing as flocking. It's like an information center where birds aren't necessarily communicating vocally to others where food is, but in the morning when a crow flies off, if there are crow individuals that do not know where a good source of food is, they'll just follow crows that look like they know where they're going. And thirdly, and the most fascinating, I think, is caching, which is not necessarily how birds find food, but it's how they keep up a steady supply of food in the winter. And birds that are well known for caching are birds that are intelligent, so corvids, which are in fact classified as songbirds, so something like a crow or a raven is a songbird. But blue jays are corvids. They will cache food, things like acorns. And chickadees are actually well-known cachers too. And so much so that, you think a chickadee is a small bird with a relatively small brain, but actually they have relatively large brains for their size, and especially relatively large hippocampi, which are just the plural for hippocampus, which is the center of the brain that is responsible for spatial memory. And studies have shown that chickadees can remember where they cached a seed for up to 28 days after they cached it. Not only can they remember where they cached it, but they can remember if they've discovered that seed and eaten it already. They can remember if somebody else has discovered it and eaten it, or they can also remember where their favorite morsels, where their favorite food items are cached. So now that we're kind of getting a feel for how birds do this complex foraging behavior in the wintertime, let's talk about what songbirds actually eat in the winter.
So I'm just outside the Grass River Center right now, and these are the remains of what were our native plant garden flowers this year. So we've got some black-eyed Susans and some landsleeve coreopsis, and especially birds that are seed specialists, like goldfinches, will definitely take advantage of this food source into the winter time. And so if you have flower heads, that still have seeds on them, things like sunflowers, thistles, or these flower species, consider definitely not deadheading them and leaving them up for as long as you can throughout the winter.
So in a similar vein to seeds, you'll often find birds like mourning doves foraging in agricultural fields for grains and corn that are dropped to the ground, at least before there's a really deep layer of snow. And then another important food source for songbirds in the winter is insects. And you might be thinking to yourself, there aren't any insects in the winter out and about, and that's true, but birds like chickadees, nuthatches, and creepers, and obviously woodpeckers too, know where to find them. So A lot of times insects will overwinter either in any stage of their life, eggs, larva, pupa, adult, under the bark of trees, often like in little crevices if the bark is peeled up a tiny bit. And so you'll often see nuthatches, both white-breasted and red-breasted, walking face first down the tree, kind of peering in those crevices looking for a meal, and then creepers will spiral up the tree the opposite way. And then chickadees, often you see them foraging on the very tips of branches, where insects sometimes overwinter, like in needle clusters. And often, you know, those tips of branches, they won't support most birds because most birds would be too heavy, but little tiny birds like chickadees and kinglets are able to forage for insects at the tips of branches. Another good place to find insects is in galls. If you watched the gall video back in August, you learned that a lot of insects overwinter in these things called galls, which are just plant abnormalities that are caused by the insect, actually, usually when it lays its eggs. And so in especially things like goldenrod galls, those like golf ball looking balls on the stems of goldenrods, you'll see holes in them, not where the larva crawled out, but actually where things like chickadees pecked a hole in the gall to get the overwintering larva in there.
And I haven't even mentioned nuts yet, but acorns and beech nuts in the uplands are favorites of things like blue jays and tufted titmice, especially in good mast years.
Another major food source is fruit for many types of songbirds, especially things like waxwings, cedar waxwings, or thrushes. If you live a little bit further south than Michigan, they don't tend to winter all the way up north, but things like robins and bluebirds. And then even cardinals will eat berries. So we're looking at some Michigan holly, also called winterberry, that you can find in swamps. Also in swamps are things like viburnums, like highbush cranberry, and then even fruit that shrivels on the vine, like wild grape, swamp rose hips, and even things like staghorn sumac, those really fuzzy looking red berries. They're not necessarily high quality fruit, but as winter wears on and there's less and less food available, birds will definitely take them. The last major food source I want to talk about for songbirds in the winter is carrion, which is just dead animal material. And so a lot of birds utilize this food source, but probably none more frequently than the raven, which, remember, is a songbird. It's the largest bird in the songbird order. And especially in places like the UP and Minnesota, where wolves exist, ravens are called wolf birds. They associate with wolves, and it actually seems like there's some sort of symbiotic relationship between the two, where actually both wolves and ravens benefit. Ravens from foraging on the carcasses of wolf kills, but wolves, it seems like they benefit from the presence of ravens because ravens occasionally lead wolves to prey, and also ravens tend to be more vigilant when feeding on the carcass than wolves, so they might be eyes out for other approaching animals. But even things like chickadees occasionally take carrion too, so yeah, it's an important food source. So I hope you guys learned something in this video, and before you start thinking that feeding your birds isn't important this winter because they can find their own food, that's true, but studies have shown that at least for black-capped chickadees, those that were fed a supplemental diet, had access to a bird feeder, their odds of surviving the winter were much higher, something like 67% versus 39% for chickadees that didn't have access. I think these studies were done in Wisconsin. So yes, feed your birds, but also know that if you forget to fill the feeder, or if you're going on vacation for a month or something, birds do not become dependent on your feeder. There's no evidence that birds that had previously had access to a feeder were not able to go right back to their natural food sources 100% of the time for feeding. All right, so I'll see you guys next week. Bye.